You've probably heard the name Jesus Christ thousands of times. I mean, it's everywhere, isn't it? Woven into, well, everything. Calendars, continents, culture.
Absolutely. It's hard to overstate the impact.
But for someone so impactful globally, how much do we actually know about the historical person, the man behind the legend?
That's the core question, really.
So today we're doing a deep dive. We're going into the historical facts, or what we can know about Jesus of Nazareth, sifting through ancient texts, scholarly arguments.
And yeah, some very conflicting accounts. Our mission is to unpack the sources, try and find those nuggets of actual historical knowledge.
We'll be looking at excerpts from a documentary, Jesus the Historical Facts documentary. And that pulls from, what, the Gospels?
Right, the New Testament Gospels, definitely. But also the earliest Christian letters, like Paul's, and crucially, those mentions from outside Christianity, people like Josephus, Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, Roman and Jewish historians.
Because the challenge, and you'll see this, is that almost everything about his life, birth, death, resurrection, it's all been debated, scrutinized endlessly by believers and non-believers.
It really has. Retrieving the historical Jesus, as scholars call it, it's this fascinating, incredibly complex puzzle.
Okay, let's get into it then.
Right.
To really understand Jesus, we need to understand his world first. Roman Judea. What was it like?
Well, you have the Jewish people. They emerge after the late Bronze Age collapse, dominating the southern Levant.
And they had kingdoms, right? Judah and Israel. People like King David, Solomon, expanding their territory.
Exactly, stretching from the Mediterranean down to the Dead Sea. But what really set them apart, especially in that ancient world full of gods, was their monotheism.
One God, all-powerful.
Which was unique, and it came with very distinct customs. Circumcision, observing the Sabbath, not eating pork, things that marked them out.
The great temple in Jerusalem, that was central.
Hugely central, the absolute heart of their worship. And importantly, it was still standing in Jesus' time. We need to keep that in mind.
Okay, so a unique people, unique faith. But their power didn't last. They fell under foreign rule.
Right. After the 8th century BC, things started to decline. Conquest by the Neo-Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar II, that's when the first temple was destroyed.
The Babylonian captivity.
Yes. Then they returned under the Persians, rebuilt the temple, the second temple, the one standing when Jesus lived. There was even a brief period of independence, the Maccabean Revolt in the 2nd century BC.
But brief is the key word there.
Very brief, yeah. The Romans were expanding. Judea became a client state, ruled by kings like Herod, who answered to Rome.
And eventually it just got absorbed fully.
By 6 AD, yes, it became the Roman province of Judea, with a Roman prefect, a governor, in charge.
And this wasn't a smooth transition. You mentioned the Jews didn't just accept Roman rule like some other peoples did.
No, they really didn't. There was immense resistance simmering underneath, fueled by, well, Roman mismanagement sometimes, and definitely by what was seen as disrespect for their temple and traditions.
Emperor Tiberius, for instance.
His policies certainly didn't help. They really inflamed tensions.
So this volatile mix, political tension, religious fervor, how did that shape the environment Jesus grew up in?
It created this hotbed of activity. You had all sorts of non-conforming religious groups. The Essenes, living communally out in the desert. The Sadducees, the wealthy temple elite, often seen as collaborators. The Zealots, pushing for violent rebellion against Rome.
Lots of different factions.
And many of them were preaching against the temple authorities, seeing them as corrupt, too close to the Romans. Plus, you had these wandering preachers, messianic figures gathering large followings, promising change, promising liberation.
And Jesus steps onto this stage.
Right into the middle of this complex, often explosive situation.
Okay, so that's the world. Now, how do we actually know anything about him? The sources, you mentioned the Gospels.
Yes, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. They're the primary sources for his life. But, and this is crucial right off the bat, they're written decades after his death.
Not eyewitness accounts penned right after the events.
No. Probably between 70 and 110 AD, so a generation or two later. Most scholars think they were likely written anonymously and only later attributed to apostles like Matthew or John to give them more authority.
And written in Greek, not Aramaic, which Jesus actually spoke.
Exactly. The earliest verifiable Christian writings we have are actually the letters of Paul, mid-1st century AD. He was an early convert, hadn't known Jesus personally during his ministry, but his letters are closer in time.
What about people outside the Christian movement? Did Romans or other Jews write about him?
We do have mentions, brief but important. Josephus, the Romano-Jewish historian writing late in the 1st century. Also, Roman writers like Pliny the Younger and Tacitus, maybe 50 to 100 years after Jesus.
What do those tell us?
They confirm his existence, the fact that he had followers and that the movement grew. From an outside perspective, that's significant. But they also suggest that Jesus himself wasn't seen as a major figure in the wider Roman world during his lifetime. He didn't exactly make headlines across the empire then.
So when we pick up the Gospels, we shouldn't expect a modern biography, like a chronological, fact-checked life story.
Absolutely not. That's a really critical point. They offer very little strict chronology. They're more like collections of his sayings, his deeds, put together to promote his teachings, to explain his significance to early believers.
And some are similar, some different. Mark, Matthew, Luke, they're the synoptics.
Right. They share a lot of material, similar structure. John's gospel is quite different. It's narrative, it's theology. It's generally seen by scholars as, well, less historically reliable for nailing down specific events.
I've also heard about the Q source. What's that?
Q. It's this hypothetical document. We don't have a copy. It's lost. But scholars think it was a collection of Jesus' sayings that both Matthew and Luke used alongside Mark's gospel when they wrote theirs.
Why is that important?
It helps explain why Matthew and Luke have similar material that isn't in Mark. But it also highlights that the gospel writers were drawing on various sources, oral traditions, maybe other written snippets. It wasn't just one single story being passed down perfectly. It's more like piecing together a mosaic.
And there were other Gospels too, right? Ones that didn't make it into the New Testament.
Yeah.
Apocryphal Gospels.
Dozens of them, yes. Most scholars think they offer very little reliable historical information about Jesus himself. Maybe the Gospel of Thomas, possibly Peter, parts of them might go back quite early, within a century or so.
So why weren't they included? Who decided?
That's a fascinating bit of history itself. It was really the leaders of the early church, especially around the time of Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, when Christianity was becoming more organized, more aligned with the state.
So they were picking and choosing.
In effect, yes. They selected the Gospels they felt were, let's say, most suitable for spreading the faith, for creating a coherent theology. Their main goal wasn't historical accuracy, as we define it today. It was building the church.
Which means we need to be careful reading the Gospels, because details might differ or things might have been, well, shaped or edited.
Exactly. Caution is key. You see differences in details between them, potential embellishments, maybe editing by later church figures to fit a certain theological point. It's complex.
This brings us to the Jesus Seminar. That was a modern attempt to figure out what Jesus actually said and did.
It was. Back in 1985, a group of American biblical scholars got together. They tried to systematically analyze the sayings and deeds attributed to Jesus in the Gospels, including Thomas.
And what did they find?
Their conclusions were pretty striking. They voted on authenticity using criteria like whether something appeared in multiple independent sources or whether it fit the historical context. They concluded only about, I think it was 16% of the deeds and 18% of the sayings were likely authentic, historically speaking.
Wow, 16 and 18%. That's surprisingly low.
It is. It really underscores the challenge of separating the historical figure from the layers of tradition and theology built up around him. How much of what we think we know comes from Jesus himself, and how much is later interpretation? It's a huge question.
Okay, given all that complexity with the sources, let's try and piece together what we can about his beginnings, his birth, his early life. It's famously debated, isn't it?
Yeah.
Even the year.
It really is. None of the Gospels give us a specific date. Scholars generally place his birth somewhere between 7 BC and 4 BC. The main clue there is King Herod the Great, who features in Matthew's nativity story. Herod died around 4 BC, so Jesus would have to have been born before that, if that story holds.
But there's a problem with the census story in Luke, right?
A big one, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Luke says Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem because of a Roman census. But the historian Josephus records a major Roman census in Judea under the governor Quirinius in 6 AD.
Which is way after Herod died.
Exactly. The timelines just don't match up easily. It really throws the whole Bethlehem birth narrative into question, or at least the timing and reason given by Luke.
So Matthew and Luke both say Bethlehem, but maybe for different reasons. Matthew has the Herod story, the flight to Egypt.
Right. Matthew's story implies they might have lived in Bethlehem initially, or links the birth there to prophecies about the Messiah coming from David's line, and Bethlehem being David's city. It raises the possibility that the emphasis on Bethlehem might be more theological than strictly historical.
To fulfill prophecy.
Possibly. It challenges this simple idea that he was definitely born in Bethlehem versus, say, Nazareth, the town he's overwhelmingly associated with later.
Speaking of Nazareth, what do we know about his childhood there? Is it just a blank slate?
Almost. The Gospels are really focused on his public ministry as an adult. Matthew calls him the son of the carpenter, or maybe craftsman, so it suggests he likely learned that trade from Joseph.
And there's that one story in Luke when he's 12.
Yes, the only story from his childhood. Him in the temple in Jerusalem, discussing religious law with the teachers, amazing them with his understanding.
Is that seen as literal history?
Most historians view it more as a literary device. Luke is foreshadowing Jesus' future role, his authority in teaching. They don't generally think Jesus saw himself or presented himself as the Son of God in that way until much later in his life, if at all, in those specific terms.
Interesting. So maybe more narrative flair than precise biography. What about siblings? Did Jesus have brothers and sisters?
The Gospels actually mention them quite plainly. Mark and Matthew list 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Jude. And they mention sisters, though not by name.
Is there outside confirmation of that?
Yes, crucially. James, the brother of the Lord, becomes a major leader in the early Jerusalem church. He's mentioned not just in the New Testament, but also by Josephus, the historian, and by Paul. That's strong evidence.
But there's theological debate about that.
Oh, there, absolutely. Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions hold that Mary remained a virgin perpetually. So they interpret these brothers and sisters differently, perhaps, as cousins or as Joseph's children from a previous marriage. It's a clear example of where historical reading and theological doctrine diverge.
Okay, so a somewhat mysterious early life. Let's move to when things really kicked off.
Yeah.
His public ministry. It starts with John the Baptist, right? His baptism.
Yes, that seems to be the catalyst. John the Baptist was this ascetic figure, a wandering preacher. He appears around 29 AD, according to Luke, the 15th year of Emperor Tiberius.
And his message?
Repentance. He was telling people Judgment Day was near, which for most Jews then didn't necessarily mean the end of the world, but a time of divine upheaval. God stepping in to redeem Israel, maybe overthrow the Romans, restore the kingdom.
And Jesus accepted this message. He got baptized by John.
The Gospels are clear on that. He goes to John, is baptized by him in the River Jordan. It suggests he aligned himself with John's movement, at least initially.
But John's career was cut short, tragically.
It was. Herod Antipas, the local ruler, a client king under Rome, got nervous. John was attracting huge crowds, talking about political upheaval, and he publicly criticized Herod's marriage to his niece, Herodias.
Not a good move politically.
Definitely not. Josephus tells us Herod had him arrested and eventually executed, beheaded.
What impact did that have on Jesus?
It's quite possible Jesus then inherited some of John's followers. He might have been seen or even saw himself as carrying on that message of repentance and God's imminent kingdom, maybe modifying it in his own way. A kind of successor figure.
After John's arrest, the Gospels talk about Jesus going into the wilderness for 40 days. Fasting, being tempted by the devil. Literal event. Or symbolic?
Again, scholars lean towards symbolic or literary. The temptations turn stones to bread, rule the world, jump from the temple. They neatly encapsulate the kinds of temptations Jesus would reject, misusing power, seeking worldly glory, testing God.
So a way for the gospel writers to frame his mission.
Precisely. To show his commitment to God's will above all else. But that doesn't mean he didn't spend time in isolation, maybe in intense prayer or contemplation, figuring out his path after John's death. That's plausible.
Then he starts his own ministry, around age 30, focused on Galilee.
Yes, unlike John, who was mostly in the wilderness near the Jordan, Jesus takes his message to the towns and villages of Galilee, his home region.
But not in Nazareth, his hometown. He was rejected there.
Apparently so. The Gospels say the people there couldn't see past the local boy, the carpenter's son, so he moves his base of operations, it seems, to Capernaum.
A town on the Sea of Galilee.
Right, and he starts teaching in synagogues, which is interesting. Synagogues weren't like the temple in Jerusalem, the place for sacrifice. They were more like community centers, places for reading scripture, discussion, debate, much more interactive.
And it's there, by the Sea of Galilee, he calls his first disciples the fishermen.
Peter, Simon, Peter and his brother Andrew, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Mark and Matthew depict him just calling them, and they drop their nets and follow.
Luke adds a miracle, doesn't he? The huge catch of fish.
He does. After Peter protests, saying they'd fished all night and caught nothing, Jesus tells them to try again. They get this massive haul, and Peter is just overwhelmed, sees it as a sign. Then they follow him.
Fish and water? They seem to pop up a lot in his story.
They really do. Lots of symbolism there, likely around themes of abundance, provision, maybe spiritual life. These first few were part of that core group, the 12, the disciples or apostles.
But the lists of the 12 in the Gospels don't quite match up, do they?
That's a sharp observation. They don't, not perfectly. There are slight variations in the names.
Why would that be?
It strongly suggests the number 12 itself was the important thing. Symbolic. Reflecting the 12 tribes of Israel, signifying a restoration of God's people. The authors might have been ensuring they had 12 names, even if the specific traditions they drew on differed slightly. You end up with 2 Jameses, maybe even 2 Judases, depending on the list.
So the exact names might be fuzzy, but the idea of a core group of 12 seems historically likely.
Yes, most scholars accept that. He had an inner circle.
Okay, so Jesus is traveling Galilee with his disciples, and the Gospels are full of miracles. Healings, exorcisms. How were these seen at the time? Was it automatically proof he was divine?
That's a really key point. For people back then, especially Jewish people, miracles weren't necessarily proof of divinity in the way later Christians understood it. Miracles could happen. Holy men, people favored by God, could perform extraordinary deeds.
So it wasn't unique to Jesus.
Not entirely. Josephus mentions other figures known for miraculous prayers, like Honey the circle maker who prayed for rain. Even Jesus' opponents, according to the Gospels, didn't deny he did powerful things. They just attributed it to evil spirits, to demonic power.
So his followers saw the miracles as a sign of God's favor.
Yes, a sign that God was working through him, that he was approved by God, but not automatically this man is God. The distinction was perhaps more between charismatics, who spoke directly to God to effect miracles, and magicians who used formulas or rituals. Mark's gospel actually includes miracles that sound a bit like magic spitting, using saliva.
Whereas Matthew and Luke use the miracles differently.
They tend to frame them more as fulfilling Old Testament prophecy or showing Jesus' compassion, especially for the marginalized, the poor, women, like healing on the Sabbath, which was controversial.
Right, he gets criticized for that, but argues it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath.
Exactly. His fame as a healer definitely spread, though. He drew huge crowds. But he also drew criticism, famously, for eating with tax collectors and sinners.
People seen as collaborators or ritually impure.
Yes. And his response was classic. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. It shows his focus was on reaching those excluded by the religious establishment.
Beyond healing, there were other types of miracles. Nature miracles.
Walking on water, calming storms, feeding the multitude with loaves and fishes, turning water into wine at Cana. These are also prominent. Again, seen by followers as signs of God's power working through him, his authority over the natural world. But whether they saw him as the ultimate source of that power during his lifetime is, well, debated.
Let's shift to his teachings then, because that's arguably the core of his legacy. Matthew and Luke really emphasize the teachings, don't they? More than Mark does.
They do. Mark is more action-oriented, miracles feature heavily. Matthew and Luke give us those big blocks of teaching material, like the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew or the Sermon on the Plain in Luke.
The Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the meek, the peacemakers.
Yes. And it's interesting to compare Matthew and Luke here. Luke's version includes not just blessings, but also woes, directed specifically at the rich, the well-fed, those who laugh now.
So Luke's Jesus sounds more socially radical, more confrontational.
You could say that, yes. Luke often portrays Jesus as championing the poor and marginalized more explicitly than Matthew does, whose version is maybe a bit more spiritualized. It's a subtle but important difference in emphasis.
A central theme in all the Gospels is the kingdom of God, or kingdom of heaven. What did Jesus actually mean by that? It seems open to interpretation.
Hugely debated among scholars. For Jews at the time, it could mean several things. God's reign in heaven after death, sure. But also, very powerfully, a future earthly kingdom where God would finally rule directly, liberate Israel, maybe resurrect the righteous.
So, a future event.
Often, yes. But it could also mean God's power breaking into the present. God answering prayers, acting in the world now. Early 20th century scholars, like Albert Schweitzer, thought Jesus expected an imminent apocalyptic end to the current age.
But that view has shifted.
Somewhat. Many contemporary scholars argue the historical Jesus spoke more about the kingdom being present in your midst, already arriving through his own words and actions, a present reality breaking in, as much as a future hope.
What's really striking is how often his teachings challenge the status quo, that idea of a reversal, The last shall be first, and the first last.
That's a core theme. You see it in the Beatitudes, blessing the poor, the mourning, the hungry. You see it in parables like the prodigal son, where the repentant sinner is welcomed back with open arms, showing God's mercy overrides strict judgment, especially maybe for those led astray by the authorities.
And he pushed beyond just following the letter of the Jewish law.
Definitely. He advocated for a higher standard, not just avoiding adultery, but avoiding lustful thoughts, not just avoiding murder, but avoiding anger. Prohibiting divorce, which was allowed under Mosaic law, telling people to turn the other cheek, love your enemies. These were radical demands.
And challenging the strict interpretation of laws, like the Sabbath.
Yes, his famous line, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." He argued that human need and compassion trumped rigid adherence to ritual law. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, he says.
So would it be fair to see him as a kind of social reformer, challenging the hierarchies?
Many scholars do see him that way, leading a movement that questioned both the Roman power structure and the Jewish religious elite. Some even point to parallels with, say, Greek Cynic philosophers who also rejected social conventions and preached simplicity.
Was he influenced by other ideas from further afield?
It's possible. Judea was a crossroads. Ideas traveled trade routes. Some suggest he might have been familiar with aspects of Zoroastrianism, maybe even Buddhist thought filtering through. He certainly seemed to oppose the strong separationist tendencies of some Jewish elites, the strict lines drawn between Jew and Gentile, pure and impure, rich and poor.
But not everyone accepted his message. The Gospels show rejection, conflict, those controversies with the Pharisees.
Right, where they criticize him for breaking the law or for his associations. Now, some of those controversy stories might be literary creations by the gospel writers, setting up a point about Jesus versus his opponents.
But there was real opposition. His behavior did alienate people.
It seems likely, yes. Eating with tax collectors, ignoring purity rules, perhaps seeming too lax compared to someone like John the Baptist, who was very ascetic. That could certainly have put some people off and definitely threatened the authorities who relied on maintaining those social and religious boundaries.
How did Jesus see himself in all this? Did he claim to be the Messiah, the Son of God?
It's complex. He certainly believed he spoke for God with God's authority. That seems clear. The title Messiah, or Christ in Greek, means anointed one, a kingly or priestly title. The Gospels portray others hailing him as Messiah and Peter confessing it, but Jesus himself seems hesitant to use the title directly, often telling people to keep quiet about it.
And Son of God.
That title appears at key moments: the Nativity, his baptism, where a voice from heaven calls him Son, Peter's confession again. Paul talks about him being designated Son of God through the resurrection, but Jesus also talks about God as Father to all people. He might have used Son in a sense of unique intimacy and authority, representing God, but not necessarily claiming divinity in the way the later church defined it.
What about Son of Man? He uses that one for himself, right?
He does, frequently. But that term was also ambiguous. It could just mean a human being. But in some Jewish apocalyptic writings, it referred to a future heavenly figure who would come in judgment and establish God's kingdom. So when Jesus used it, was he talking about himself now, or that future figure? Or both?
So a lot of ambiguity around the titles. He might have seen his role differently than how those titles were later understood.
Very possibly. Maybe something like a viceroy of God, as some scholars suggest. Someone acting with God's full authority on earth, ushering in the kingdom, but distinct from God the Father. It's hard to pin down precisely.
Okay, so the tensions are building. His teachings are radical. He's challenging authority, attracting crowds, making claims. This all leads him to Jerusalem, doesn't it, for the final act?
Yes, for the Passover festival. A huge pilgrimage feast. The city would have been packed. This is the event Christians remember at Easter. Most scholars think this was probably his third year of ministry, maybe around 33 years old. The year is debated, but maybe around 29 or 30 AD fix the timeline of Pontius Pilate being the Roman prefect.
And his entry into Jerusalem is dramatic, riding a donkey.
Highly symbolic, evoking prophecies like Zechariah's about a humble king arriving. The crowds, according to the Gospels, greet him like royalty, shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," hailing him as an heir to King David. It's deliberately provocative.
And then he goes to the temple, the famous cleansing of the temple.
Right, overturning the tables of the money changers, the people selling doves for sacrifice. He accuses them of making God's house a den of robbers, a direct assault on the temple establishment and its commercial operations.
He also predicts the temple's destruction, not one stone left on another.
He does, according to the Gospels. But again, we have to remember the Gospels were written after the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD.
So the prophecy likely reflects that known event.
It's highly probable, yes. Framed as prediction, but informed by hindsight. Regardless, his actions in the temple, his claims, his growing following, this absolutely terrified the temple authorities, and likely Herod Antipas too. He was a direct threat to their power and the delicate balance they maintained with Rome.
This brings us to the Last Supper, the Passover meal with his disciples.
Yes, where he predicts his betrayal. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, had apparently made a deal with the temple authorities, 30 pieces of silver, to identify Jesus to them.
And this is where the Christian Eucharist or communion originates?
Exactly. Jesus breaks bread, this is my body, shares wine, this is my blood of the covenant. These actions become absolutely central to Christian ritual and theology, symbolizing his sacrifice.
After the meal, he's arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yes. Judas identifies him with a kiss, a prearranged signal. He's taken first to the Jewish authorities, the high priest, Caiaphas.
And they charge him with blasphemy, recommend execution.
According to the Gospels, yes. Blasphemy for claiming divine authority. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish high court, confirms this quickly. But they didn't have the authority to carry out capital punishment under Roman rule.
So they had to hand him over to the Romans, to Pontius Pilate.
Exactly, to the Roman prefect. And this is where the gospel accounts become particularly problematic for historians.
How so? They depict Pilate as reluctant, finding Jesus innocent, but giving in to the Jewish leaders in the crowd.
Yes, washing his hands of it, literally in Matthew's account. But historically, Pilate had a reputation for being ruthless, not someone easily swayed by local pressure when Roman interests or order were at stake. Crucifixion was a Roman punishment, typically for sedition or rebellion against Rome.
So why would the Gospels portray it this way?
Well, think about when they were written. After the Jewish revolt against Rome, 66 to 70 AD, early Christians, increasingly Gentiles, wanted to distance themselves from Judaism, which is now seen as rebellious by Rome. They wanted to present Christianity as compatible with Roman rule.
So, shifting the blame for Jesus' death from the Romans onto the Jewish authorities served a purpose.
It seems likely. It helped absorb Christians into the Roman world. But tragically, this portrayal fueled anti-Jewish sentiment for centuries. It's a really sobering example of how historical narratives can be shaped by later agendas.
So Pilate orders the crucifixion. Jesus is led out, crucified alongside two criminals, Golgotha.
Yes. On Friday morning, the 15th of Nisan, according to the Jewish calendar, his last words in Mark and Matthew are that cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
What's the meaning of that? Despair.
It's debated. It's the opening line of Psalm 22, which actually ends on a note of hope and vindication. So was it despair or quoting scripture? Or perhaps a genuine cry of feeling abandoned, maybe lament that God hadn't intervened as he perhaps expected? We can't know for sure. But shortly after, he died. Jesus of Nazareth was dead.
But the story doesn't end there for Christianity. The empty tomb, the resurrection.
Right. Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy sympathizer, gets permission from Pilate to bury the body in his own tomb. They do it quickly before the Sabbath begins. Then, on Sunday morning, women followers go to the tomb and find it empty.
And then the appearances. The disciples claim they saw him.
Yes, multiple accounts of him appearing to Mary Magdalene, to the disciples, to larger groups. Paul, writing earliest, describes his own experience of seeing the resurrected Christ, not as a ghost, he says, but in a spiritual body, something different from a normal physical body.
How do historians approach the resurrection itself?
Generally, the resurrection event itself falls outside the scope of historical inquiry. History deals with events within the natural world, things we can potentially verify through evidence. A supernatural event like resurrection is typically seen as a matter of faith, of theology, rather than something history can prove or disprove.
But the belief in the resurrection, that's undeniably historical, right? It changed everything.
Absolutely. That belief was the catalyst. It transformed a group of terrified, scattered followers into people willing to risk everything to spread his message. Peter, James, John, and especially Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, the persecutor turned apostle.
They took the message out across the Roman Empire.
With incredible speed and effectiveness, initially maybe focusing on fellow Jews, but very quickly shifting to proselytizing among Gentiles, non-Jews.
And it grew rapidly.
Astonishingly so. By the early 2nd century, there were significant Christian communities all around the Eastern Mediterranean, and during the crises of the 3rd century in the Roman Empire, Christianity experienced massive growth, despite periods of intense persecution by the state.
Until eventually, It takes over.
Emperor Constantine is the turning point. The Edict of Milan in 313 grants tolerance. Then he begins actively promoting Christianity, sponsoring councils, building churches, setting it on the path to becoming the official state religion of the Roman Empire by the end of that century.
It's an incredible journey. From this small, radical Jewish sect in a corner of the empire.
To becoming the dominant religion that would shape Western civilization and indeed world history for the next 2 millennia. It's quite a story.
So, as you've heard today, digging into the historical Jesus, it's incredibly complex. We're piecing things together from sources that are diverse, sometimes contradictory, often written with their own agendas.
From the debates about his birth, through his radical teachings, the politics surrounding his death, the mystery of the resurrection claims, it's definitely not a simple, straightforward biography.
But despite those challenges, despite how hard it is to separate the historical man from the figure developed by centuries of faith, his impact is undeniable, isn't it?
Absolutely undeniable. This figure, Jesus of Nazareth, regardless of the precise historical details we struggle to recover, sparked a movement that fundamentally reshaped the world. His historical significance is immense.
So as you reflect on this deep dive, maybe think about this. How do these complexities, these historical puzzles and debates, affect how you understand the beliefs and narratives that have shaped so much of our world? What surprised you most? What detail about the historical Jesus stands out? And does it change how you see his legacy?